Okay, thanks everybody for coming. And today I'm going to be speaking on Papias of Hierapolis. So this is the structure of what I'm going to talk on. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Papias, highlight the reference by Lerenaeus to Papias. Then the major part will be on references from the church history by Eusebius of Caesarea, and then come back to the subject of are the Gospels based on eyewitness sources. So who is Papias? Papias was an early church father. He lived from around about 60 to 130 AD. And he was Bishop of Hierapolis. And I've got a map here showing modern Turkey. And this area here in what is called the province of Asia is where the 7 churches of Revelation were. So you've got Pergamon, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, and Ephesus and Smyrna, as well as Colossae. And Hierapolis is amongst these. It was on a major intersection of a western and kind of a southern route, and so it was quite a prominent town. And today the Hierapolis is of historical interest, so it has many ancient ruins, and so it's a bit of a tourist attraction. But Papias was Bishop of Hierapolis, and he wrote exposition of the oracles or sayings of the Lord. And this was written about 95 to 120 AD, probably around about 100 AD, and is the earliest extant record of the origins of the Gospels. I might mute you all if I know how. Right, I don't know how, so I'll continue on. All right, exposition of the sayings of the Lord.
Do you want to make me co-host? Go to participants down the bottom and click on mine, and under my name it'll say more, and then say sit as co-host. And I can mute people that are making noise.
All right, so let's see, make co-host. All right, you got it. Okay, exposition to the sayings of the Lord. This document it's a document of 5 books, and the early church fathers had access to it. Now, it was extant in the Middle Ages. In other words, people had copies of this in the Middle Ages, but unfortunately, the exposition of the sayings of the Lord are now lost. Right. Dating of the expositions of the Lord, sayings of the Lord. Some previously dated it late, which is a tendency of skeptical scholars, to 130 to 160 AD. And this was based on 2 references, one regarding the death of Polycarp and another associated with the reign of Hadrian. But both references have been shown to be mistaken, and there's plenty of evidence that it was dated early. Most of the quotations come from Eusebius, who wrote church history, and chapter 39 is where you have the major reference to Papias, and it's at the end of book 3. And in book 4 commences with the 12th year of the Trajan, who was a Roman emperor, and the 12th year of Trajan was 109 AD. So Eusebius wrote in chronological order, so the implication from this is that Papias occurred prior to the 12th year of Trajan. Papias also knew and met Aristion and John the Elder and Philip's daughters. And Aristion and John were witnesses to Jesus. And so it could not have been too late if that's in fact true, that he actually knew people who were witnesses to Jesus. The writing, even though he refers back to meetings with Aristion and John the Elder, those meetings probably predated the writing of the document itself. So you have to kind of separate the issue. When was the document written and when did these meetings actually take place? Also, Papias was a contemporary of Ignatius, and he was recording events prior to the writing of the actual books. So he probably wrote between, say, 100 and 120, but the events he refers to occurred much earlier. And the earliest mention of Papias was in around about 170 AD, and it was by Lerenaeus, an early church father, and he lived between around about 130 and 202 AD, but he actually wrote against heresies in around about 170 AD. And he refers to Papias in chapter 3, section 4, and it's just an incidental remark. And this is what he said. And these things, he was actually talking about Jacob's blessings, but we won't bother with that, are borne witness to in the writings by Papias, the hearer of John, and a companion of Polycarp in his 4th book, for there were 5 books compiled by him. So from this we learn that Papias was a hearer of John, who was a direct, so he actually had direct access to an eyewitness. He was also a companion of Polycarp, and he wrote a book in 5 parts. So this is all that we get from Irenaeus. But the major references actually come from Eusebius of Caesarea. So Eusebius lived from around about 260 AD through to around about 340 AD, and he was very close to the Emperor Constantine. And he wrote the church history, which is an enormously valuable document because it gives the history of the early church. It's quite unique. So he's also the main source for Papias. And he refers to Papias in chapters 15, 36, and 39 of the church history. So we're going to read all that he says about Papias, which is not a huge amount. So the first reference is from chapter 15. This slide doesn't mention Papias at all, but it gives some background about the authorship of the Gospel of Mark, and then it flows into a brief reference to Papias. So from Eusebius. So greatly did the splendor of piety illumine the minds of Peter's hearers, that they were not satisfied with hearing once only, and were not content with the unwritten teaching of the divine gospel. But with all sorts of entreaties, they besought Mark, a follower of Peter, and the one whose gospel is extant, that he would leave them a written monument of the doctrine which had been originally communicated to them. Nor did they cease until they had prevailed with the man, and had thus become the occasion of the written gospel which bears the name of Mark. And they say that Peter, when he had learned, through a revelation of the Spirit, of that which had been done, was pleased with the zeal of the men, and that the work obtained the sanction of his authority for the purpose of being used in the churches. So, from this quotation here, we learn that the second gospel was written by Mark, the companion of Peter. That's according to Eusebius. And then chapter 15 goes on just to make a brief comment. So Clement of Alexandria, in the 8th book of his Hypotypos, gives this account, and with him agrees the bishop of Hierapolis named Papias. So Anne and I had a huge argument on how you actually pronounce this name, Hipposes or whatever, by Clement of Alexandria has not survived. We don't have that. But the Eusebius claims that both Clement and Papias affirmed that the second gospel was written by Mark, a follower of Peter. So that's all there is in chapter 15. Chapter 36. This is again a statement by Eusebius. At that time, Polycarp, a disciple of the apostles, was a man of eminence in Asia, having been entrusted with the episcopate of the church of Smyrna by those who had seen and heard the Lord. And at the same time, Papias, bishop of the parish of Hierapolis, became well known, as did also Ignatius, who was chosen bishop of Antioch, second in succession to Peter, and whose fame is still celebrated by a great many. So from this we learn that Papias was a contemporary with Polycarp and Ignatius, and so Polycarp lived from about 69 to 155 AD, and Ignatius from 50 to 117 AD. So that kind of gives some sort of dating indication for Polycarp. However, the major reference to Papias is from chapter 39 of church history. And we're going to read the whole chapter 39. Most of it is commentary by Eusebius. So what I've done is quotes from Papias are highlighted in yellow, and all the other writing is in white. So first of all, Eusebius makes a reference back to what we had already read from Lerenaeus. So Eusebius, there are extant 5 books of Papias, which bear the title Expositions of the Oracles of the Lord. Lerenaeus makes mention of these as the only works written by him in the following words. These things are attested by Papias, an ancient man who was a hearer of John and a companion of Polycarp, in his 4th book, for 5 books have been written by him. So these are the words of Lerenaeus which we previously quoted. And here, Eusebius states that that Papias had no direct contact with the 12. It says, but Papias himself, in the preface to his discourses, by no means declares that he was himself a hearer, an eyewitness of the holy apostles, but he shows by the words which he uses that he received the doctrines of the faith from those who were their friends. So Papias did not have any direct contact with the 12. He had direct contact with other direct eyewitnesses who were what he refers to as the disciples of the Lord, which we'll have a look at later, but they were not amongst the 12. Papias's motive. Papias says, and this is this is quote what Eusebius is quoting Papias having said in his oracles. But I shall not hesitate also to put down for you, along with my interpretations, whatsoever things I have at any time learned carefully from the elders and carefully remembered, guaranteeing their truth. For I did not, like the multitude, take pleasure in those that speak much, but in those that teach the truth. Not in those that relate strange commandments, but in those that deliver the commandments given by the Lord to faith and springing from the truth itself. So I've got my comments. I put them as commentary. So he mentions the elders. So I have at any time learned carefully from the elders. So who are these elders? Well, this kind of gets expanded upon a little bit later. They seem to have heard the commandments given by the Lord. Because he says, learn carefully from the elders and carefully remembered, guaranteeing their truth. For I did not take pleasure in those that speak much, but in those that teach the truth. Not in those that relate strange commandments, but in those that deliver the commandments given by the Lord. So the implication there is that the elders were amongst those that delivered the commandments given by the Lord. Papias desired eyewitness testimony and wanted the truth. He wasn't interested in idle chatter. He wanted to know the commandments of the Lord. And Papias goes on. If then anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I questioned him in regards to the words of the elders, what Andrew or what Peter said, or what was said by Philip or by Thomas, or by James, or by John, or by Matthew, or by any other of the disciples of the Lord, and what things Aristion and the presbyter John, the disciples of the Lord, say. For I did not think that what was to be gotten from the books would profit me as much as what came from the living and abiding voice. So here's the commentary. Papias questioned followers of the elders. So that in itself could be second or third hand. regarding what the apostles said. But he says he valued the living and abiding voice over the written word. So why did he value the living and abiding voice over the written word? Well, I guess it's the same reason that we do. It's a lot more effective to actually talk to a teacher than just read something out of a book, because you have to and fro. And you can actually question, but you can't question a book. But this statement that he actually valued the living and abiding voice over the written word has often been cited as evidence for dependence on an evolving oral tradition, rather than getting accurate information about what actually happened. So is he referring to evolving Chinese whispers? And what was his main concern? Was he actually trying to find the truth? So I'll let you judge that from what he actually said. But another interesting question, though, is he refers to people called Aristion and the presbyter John. So who are Aristion and the presbyter John? And if we actually look back at the quote again, it talks about Aristion and the presbyter John, what they say, present tense, rather than what they said. So the implication is there that these people were actually alive and contemporaries with Papias. So the present tense, that should be tense, not tens, for say indicates that they were actually contemporaries. So, but in his reference there's an implication that there are actually two Johns, not one. And this is what Eusebius says. The first one, first John he's referring to, he mentions in connection with Peter and James and Matthew and the rest of the apostles, clearly meaning the evangelist, that is John the son of Zebedee. But the other John he mentions after an interval and places him among others outside the number of the apostles, even putting Aristion before him. And he distinctly calls him a presbyter. This shows that the statement of those is true, who say that there were two persons in Asia that bore the same name, and that there were two tombs in Ephesus, each of which, even to the present day, is called John's. And Anne and I went to Ephesus at one stage and were actually taken to a tomb, supposedly of John, but we didn't see two. So the first John was the apostle, son of Zebedee. The second is distinct and placed after Aristion. And there were two tombs, two John in Asia. So there were two people going around who were highly regarded, and both of them were called John. So did Papias have access to direct eyewitnesses? And Eusebius goes on to say, it is important to notice this, for it is probable that it was the second, if one is not willing to admit that it was the first that saw the revelation, which is ascribed by name to John. And Papias, of whom we are now speaking, confesses that he received the words of the apostles from those that followed them, but says that he was himself a hearer of Aristion and the presbyter John. At least he mentions them frequently by name and gives their traditions in his writings. These things, we hope, have not been uselessly adduced by us. So here's a commentary. Eusebius had access to the whole 5 books, which we don't. So when he actually talks about, he mentions them frequently by name, he's probably referring to the fact that he had read the whole of the oracles, and we only have what Eusebius quotes. But he's implying that there's many other references to Papias that he hasn't quoted. So it seems that Papias had direct access to disciples other than the 12 who actually knew Jesus. Philip and his daughters. Eusebius says, but it is fitting to subjoin the words of Papias, which have been quoted, other passages from his works, in which he relates some other wonderful events which he claims to have received from tradition. That Philip the Apostle dwelt at Hierapolis with his daughters has been already stated. Well, it hasn't stated to us, but he's saying it has already been stated in the book. But it must be noted here that Papias, their contemporary, says that he heard a wonderful tale from the daughters of Philip, for he relates that in his times one rose from the dead. So Eusebius claims that Papias was a contemporary of Philip's daughters and that he had contact with Philip's daughters. So Eusebius derived this from other passages which he has not quoted and which we can't see. Here's a reference to other additions to the 12, and he refers to a guy called Justus. And he tells another wonderful story of Justus, surnamed Barsabbas, that he drank a deadly poison and yet by the grace of the Lord suffered no harm. The book of Acts records that the holy apostles, after the ascension of the Saviour, put forward this Justus together with Matthias and prayed that one might be chosen in place of the traitor Judas to fill up their number. So this is part of what's already reported in Acts. The account is as follows. And they put forward two, Joseph called Barsabbas, who is surnamed Justus, and Matthias, and they prayed and said, ... but he doesn't say what they say. However, Eusebius didn't necessarily have a very high opinion of Papias. So he says the same writer gives also other accounts which he says came to him through unwritten tradition. Certain strange parables and teachings of the Saviour and some other more mythical things. To these belong his statement that there will be a period of some 1,000 years after the resurrection of the dead, and that the kingdom of Christ will set up in material form on this very earth. I suppose he got these ideas through a misunderstanding of the apostolic accounts, not perceiving that the things said by them were spoken mystically in figures. For he appears to have been a very limited understanding, as one can see from his discourses. So Eusebius had a low view of Papias's understanding, and Eusebius disparaged premillennialism. So he didn't agree with premillennialism, so he thought that anybody who actually believed it must have had very little understanding. So his account, but from what we can say about this, his account is unlikely to be contrived for apologetic purposes. So if he made the whole story up, he wouldn't have created a character and then said he was dumb. So it wouldn't have served an apologetic intent. So it kind of leads you to think that what he's saying is he's being quite genuine. Papias' impact on subsequent early church fathers. But it was due to him that so many of the church fathers after him adopted a like opinion, urging in their own support the antiquity of the man. As for instance, Lerenaeus and anyone else that may have proclaimed similar views. So Lerenaeus probably proclaimed views like premillennialism. Papias gives also in his own work other accounts of the words of the Lord on the authority of Aristion, who was mentioned above, and traditions as handed down by the presbyter John, to which we refer to those who are fond of learning. So Papias affected the views of subsequent early church fathers, but it was mainly, according to Eusebius, was because of his antiquity, not because of his brilliance. Eusebius reaffirms Papias' contact with Aristion and John the Presbyter by referring to the rest of the oracles, which of course we don't have. Now, Papias also makes comments on Mark. And now we must add to the words of his, which we have already quoted, the tradition which he gives in regard to Mark, the author of the Gospel. It is in the following words. This also the presbyter said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him. But afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them. For he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which had been heard. and not to state any of them falsely. So commentary. The second, he affirms that the second gospel is written by Mark, Peter's companion. Mark was not a direct eyewitness, but he recorded Peter's testimony. And Papias explains Mark's chronological discrepancies. Because if you actually go through Mark and Matthew and Luke, all the little accounts are not necessarily in the same order. And so what Papias is doing is provide an explanation why this was so, because Peter didn't actually speak them in order according to Papias. Papias also makes a commentary on Matthew. These things are related by Papias concerning Mark, but concerning Matthew he writes as follows. So then Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able. So people have been arguing over what did he actually mean this, that he wrote in the Hebrew language and everyone interpreted them as he was able. So here there's a claim that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. And there is the implication that Matthew's Hebrew was chronologically correct. It was more accurate than what Mark had written. But a number of church fathers also claim that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. However, modern scholars don't think that's possible because we've, for various reasons. And it's the Greek version and interpretation of what Matthew originally wrote. So a lot of church fathers say that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, but we've got no textual evidence, and scholars claim that there seems to be no evidence within the Greek version of Matthew that was actually derived from Hebrew, though it's disputed by some as well. Papias on John and Peter. And the same writer uses testimonies from the first epistle of John and from that of Peter likewise. And he relates another story of a woman who was accused of many sins before the Lord, which is contained in the gospel according to the Hebrews. These things we have thought it necessary to observe in addition to what has already been stated. So commentary. Papias knew about 1 John. And if you say the first epistle, that implies there must have at least been a second. So he must have also been aware, this is saying that Papias must have also been aware of 2 John, or perhaps even 3 John as well. So this is kind of evidence that 1 John, or a couple of the epistles of John, were circulating at the time that Papias wrote his oracles. But Papias also knew about an epistle of Peter. So the same implication is there, that these documents were actually circulating at the time of Papias. And Papias also knew the story of the woman caught in adultery. So this is from John 8. And usually this is bracketed as saying it's the interpolation because it's not in the earliest versions of John, the earliest manuscripts. But he's actually saying that this story is actually contained in another gospel called the Gospel according to the Hebrews. So it might have been actually grabbed from that and whacked into John. So now, all right, so that's the end of chapter 39. So we're going to come to the general question is, are the Gospels based on eyewitness accounts? So the things I'm going to discuss under this heading is form criticism, what Papias says, what Luke says, and the Gospel of John, and a little bit about John the Elder. There's a German phrase called Sitz im Leben, and this is the catch cry of form criticism. So Sitz im Leben is German and it means setting in life. So, and what they're referring to is the alleged context in which the text was created. So they're talking about the Gospels. So they're asking the question, what was the context when the Gospels were actually created? What it doesn't mean is it's not setting, so not the setting in which reported events occurred, and that's quite different. All right. So if it was Sitz im Leben was referring to the setting in which reported events occurred, well, that means you're trying to gain an understanding of the events. But they're not doing that. They're trying to get an understanding of the situation when the document was created, which is supposedly many years later. So some of the tenets of form criticism is this. Primarily form criticism is saying what type of text this is, like how to classify the different texts, whether they might be parable or a narrative or whatever. But what form criticism's saying is that the stories originally were maintained by oral tradition, and that the stories evolved by Chinese whispers. And when the Gospels were recorded, they were adapted to the needs of the churches at that time. So later oral tradition was captured in written Gospels and is not the record of eyewitnesses. So the form criticism represents an interpretation based on the needs of the church at the time that it was written. And therefore, they say that the Gospels have little historical value. So is there evidence for this? I would say the strongest evidence for this is our current day. So consider the modern context. And I'll let this relate to your own experience, and so ask yourself these questions. So do preachers adapt or cherry pick the text to suit the needs of the church, pander to popular appeal, or avoid offence? Does that happen today? So maybe, maybe not. All right. So did the early church face the same temptations? Well, I guess if we do it today, they would have faced the same thing then too. So yes, but Papias says no. At least that wasn't his personal attitude. So Papias had access to direct eyewitnesses. And he says he wasn't interested in idle tales. So he actually wanted to know what Jesus actually said and did. I think it's quite apparent from what he wrote. And also, let's see if this correlates with what we actually hear within the Gospels themselves. So this is Luke's prologue. And he says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled amongst us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. So there's kind of 5 bullet points that actually come out from this. It says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled amongst us. So Luke is saying at the time that he was writing, there were prior written accounts. And the implication is he probably looked at them. So he looked at the prior written accounts. Now it says, just as. This is the word karthos. The car is short for kata, which means according to. And I forgot what those means. But you could actually expand this to mean, kathos means in the same way that. So many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have happened in the same way that they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So the first item there, the written accounts, comes after the second item, which was the handing down by the eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So what he's actually saying is that many undertook to draw up written accounts, reflecting what was actually handed down to them by those who are eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So he's making a claim that the written accounts that he had access to reflected the views of the eyewitnesses. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So he's saying that he did an investigation and that he wrote an orderly account as a result of that investigation. So, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. And the word taught is related to the word catechis. So here, in the way that you have been catechized. So Theophilus had actually gone through a teaching process, which was similar to what we call a catechism. And so Luke is providing him certainty regarding what he'd already been catechized in. So from Luke 1, you kind of get the strong impression that they were very interested in what the eyewitnesses said. Now, a reference to John the Elder. There are 3 epistles of John, and the style of those 3 epistles is much like John's Gospel. So it seems highly likely that the person who wrote the 3 epistles also wrote the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, the author identifies himself as a disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, in one, you've got 1, 2, and 3 John, and the 2nd John and 3rd John commence with the statement, the elder, to Gaius, or I forget the lady, and yeah, noble lady or something, in 2nd John, but he calls himself the elder. So if you actually whack the 2 together, you say, all right, in John, the author identifies himself as a disciple whom Jesus loved. And in 2nd and 3rd John, he calls himself the elder. So it's likely that these 2 people, the disciple whom Jesus loved and the elder, are one and the same person. So I've been looking at a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Balcom, and he contends that the Gospel of John wasn't written by John the son of Zebedee, but by John the elder. So these 2 people are likely to be one and the same. So now looking at John 21, 20 to 24, this is where John self-identifies himself as the one whom Jesus loved. So Peter turned and saw that the disciples whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the same one who leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, Lord, who is going to betray you? Then ... then he says, this is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. So here you have strong identification that the one whom Jesus loved was the one who actually wrote the Gospel of John, and that he had leaned against Jesus at the supper. So he's clearly identifying to be an eyewitness. And now we'll come to 1 John 1:3. And this is partly out of the NIV and partly the version written by Kevin Rogers. And this is what it says. That which was from the beginning, that which we have heard, that which we have seen with our eyes, that which we have looked at and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared. We have seen it and testify it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life which the Father and which has appeared to us. We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that also you also may have fellowship with us. Now, a bit that I've actually changed is that which. So that kind of reflects what's actually there in the Greek. You have the word ha, and it's ha means that which, and it's repeated 4 times, and it's kind of a type of alliteration, and it's quite dramatic in the Greek. But often they don't reflect that in English translations. You also get a repeat of the word and. I haven't highlighted that, but there's a sequence of and, and it's another form of alliteration. So the Greek is extremely dramatic. But here we have the elders claim. It says, we've that which was from the beginning, we've heard, seen with our eyes, looked at, and our hands have touched. And he repeats it again. We have seen and testify to it. We proclaim to you the eternal life which with the Father and has appeared to us. We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard. So there's kind of an absolute claim here of direct eyewitness contact in the most empirical way. So the form critics may claim that it's the stories were captured out of an evolving oral tradition and then reflected the needs of the church. But that is not what Papias says. It's not what Luke says, and it's not what the elder says. So that's it. Thank you very much. Okay. Our normal format at this stage is to break for supper, but of course we're a bit limited in that regard. And so supper's over. All right, so at this point it's now open for you to participate, and I'll just stop screen sharing at the moment so get a better view of each other. Usually as the Supreme Most High of Reasonable Faith Adelaide, I exercise the divine right to have the first comment, but there's no need for that today, so it's over to you.
Okay, Kevin, back to Eusebius. You may remember that about 2 years ago, you asked me to give the presentation on Eusebius, and the reason he seemed to be very much a post-millennial. He'd just gone through the horror of Diocletian's reign, and then Constantine came on, and he wrote, I think it's The Life of Constantine, in which he believed the millennium had come with the arrival of Constantine. All the horrors that had beset the church were now past. We now have a Christian emperor for the first time. Everything's fine and beautiful. The millennium has arrived with the arrival of Constantine. That was his view. That's what he put forward. And that's why he didn't want anyone else telling him there's going to be premillennial doctrine.
Right. That's interesting. So he had a subversive motive, did he?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, let's face it, he'd been through Diocletian's reign and the other 3 emperors that were reigning with him. And yeah, it was a horrible time. And as I'm sure you read the church history, you know, it was horrible. And then suddenly, bursting on the scene, we now have a Christian emperor. And for him, and it comes out, for instance, he writes off the Jews. There is no future for the Jews. They crucified the Lord. They've been scattered to the four ends of the earth. They deserted everything they got. For him, it's all about the fact that we now have a Christian emperor Rome's now the centre of the world. Mind you, 100 years later, of course, it was sacked. But no, his view was that Constantine was now issuing in the millennium.
Right. Okay, any comments on that? Or
Well, I think that this means that he had a very high view of Constantine in the plan of God, and that would colour things that he said about Constantine and about the state of the church right at the time of Constantine, but it doesn't negate what he would have to say about church history. You know, sure, every historian has their own particular point of view, their own prejudices, but and that will colour to some extent the things he records. But I do think overall, Eusebius, I've read church history quite carefully a while ago, and it's very interesting. It seems to all hang together, and I think there's a great deal of value in his book, Church History. So I think the things he says about Papias and all the things preceding him, the history of the church, are probably overall quite valuable and should be, you know, we haven't got any better word about the history of that period, have we?
Yeah, but look, I think if I may say, Jeff, he certainly ignores Romans chapter 11 about, you know, Paul distinctly says, after the last Gentile is saved, all the Jews will be saved. No, he writes them off completely. You know, I'm sure you got that out of there. He said, oh, you know, they're bad guys. They rebelled against Rome. That's why Hadrian, you know, wiped them out in 135 AD.
Yeah.
And he has nothing about the future for Israel in the future because, no, it's the church that's it's everything now. There's no need for a temple or anything like that.
I think that you'll find, that chapter of Romans 11, interestingly, in our own particular church, at our own home fellowship, we're actually going through that very section of Romans, those chapters leading up to and including Romans 11. We've only just been doing that recently at the Coromandel Baptist Church.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's just incidentally. But that part of Romans 11 is disputed as to what it means. Does it mean that all the Jews will be saved? What is actually meant by that statement, all Israel will be saved? Because it says elsewhere that we, Gentile Christians, are the Israel of God. The church is now Israel of God. And so some people come to the conclusion that the church, the Gentile church, has displaced ancient Israel. Others say, no, that's not the case. It does refer to God's future plan for the Jewish people. And I think that God does actually have a plan for the Jewish people, as he has for the people of all the peoples of the world. And so that there will always, in every age, there's been a remnant of the Jews who have been saved and who will be saved.
Yes. Look, I didn't want to go too much into that.
I do think
just to say he felt Constantine's arrival was the beginning of the millennium, and I don't think anyone would now.
Yeah.
I think
Well, personally, I'd align a lot more with Papias's view than with Eusebius on that.
Yeah.
I think one of the points that Kevin was trying to bring across with that, though, is that if Eusebius doesn't like Papias, then anything that he says about him that we can learn from, it's kind of the view of someone who disagrees. So therefore, we can pay double attention to it. He's not trying to build up the guy. So therefore, if it comes across good, then it must be good.
Oh, yeah, I'm not trying to deny. Look, Eusebius was a great historian, but he came, well, certainly by the time he was completing, and maybe he did a number of revisions of church history, I don't know, but certainly by the time Constantine had arrived, he'd seen this huge swing of favour to the church from what had been under, and he thought, no, this is surely the arrival of the millennium.
Well, the Roman Empire did go for 1,000 years, didn't it?
It did, but certainly,
I wouldn't put too much on that, though.
Can I get a bit of clarity about Matthew originally writing in Hebrew? Where does that come from?
Well, as Papias' statement, that's what he stated. But there are several other church fathers, I can't recall who they were, who also said the same thing. But it's not taken or not believed widely by scholars today.
Because we know a lot more than they would have known back at the time.
Of course. But I think they're based on saying that the Greek does not reflect a Hebrew origin. But another scholar's actually gone and tried to translate the Greek back into Hebrew and made the comment it was remarkably easy, that they actually did seem to mesh. So not everybody believes that, but I think the majority view is that Matthew was originally written in Greek. But there's also another interesting item that in around about the 14th century, a guy did come up with a Hebrew version of Matthew's Gospel. It wasn't a very good one, but the interesting thing is this character was not a friend of Christianity. He was anti-Christian, and he was actually using a Hebrew version of Matthew. But there's a long gap between the 14th century and the 1st century, and that's the first account we have of any Hebrew version of Matthew.
Does it have to be all one or all the other? I'm thinking of, I mean, Matthew was from the area of the Decapolis, which was a very heavily sort of Greek-influenced part of the world, and had been for 350 years or so. A lot of people around that part of the world would have been bilingual, so maybe it was a bit of both in the original.
Well, I'm not sure.
Yeah, Matthew's always been regarded as the most Jewish of the gospel writers, hasn't he?
Yes.
You know, with the emphases he's got, the way the book is structured, sort of matching the 5 books of Moses, and various other things I can't think of at the moment, but he's the one too who constantly refers to the Old Testament scriptures and said, you know, this happened, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah or one of the prophets, blah, 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 you know, and he does that repeatedly, and he does that the way that the other gospel writers don't. So he, for various reasons, he's always been thought of as the most Jewish of the 4 gospel writers.
And I think
that doesn't mean he necessarily wrote in Hebrew.
I think, to be fair, I think he's often called Levi as well. So it appears as though he may have been from the tribe of Levi, with a very, I guess, biblical background to his upbringing.
One of the things that Kevin referred to is the Sitz and leben, the situation in which the gospel was written, and was generally considered in the early church that Matthew wrote his gospel very early when the church was mostly Jewish. And so therefore it did reflect that particular fact when he wrote it.
There's
That
also
and he's the first, you know.
Yeah, there's also discussion in terms of what he meant when he said Hebrew. So people said, did he actually mean Aramaic? Or
very likely.
Yeah, or did he mean in the Hebrew style? So saying, all right, he might have written in Greek, but with a Hebrew bent. But I think majority opinion is it's pretty explicitly saying he literally wrote it down in the Hebrew language, not Aramaic. But then they're saying that's what he said, but we don't believe him.
What if we got the stuff that you've been reading from Eusebius? How far back does the sources for that date? Like, what have we got? We got parchments and stuff for that, or have we just got traces, or, you know, historical evidence of that? Like, what have we actually got from that period? Do you know?
Well, are you saying from Eusebius? Like, how secure is the text of Eusebius?
Well, yeah. Well, he's the one you're quoting to talk about Papias, right?
Yeah.
So if he's quoting Papias with the oracles that we don't have, then what have we got from Eusebius? Is that on like, what's the form of that, and how early does that date? I think you might have covered this right up front, but I came in a little late.
No, I didn't. So the answer is I don't know. But I would imagine that his church history would be well attested.
Yes. Can I make a point here, Kevin? Again,
Yep.
it comes out of when we gave Eusebius 2 years ago. He was the bishop of
Caesarea.
Caesarea. As such, he sat in a library that had been gathering there, and it was largely preserved during the Roman wars against the Jews, because remember, Caesarea was the Roman part, and so it retained, without any destruction, most of the records that dated right back to the time of Jesus. He himself was certainly not an eyewitness by any account, but he certainly had access to records in the proximity of Judea that dated right back to the time of the original writings.
But what have we got of him? And Stephen, I certainly remember you presenting on. It can't be 2 years ago. Surely that was last year, wasn't it? Surely that was last year.
Yeah, I reckon it was 2 years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Far out. Like in normal time or COVID time? It's closer.
Well, he certainly wrote around 260 AD. That was his time frame. So yes, he was three.
No, that's when he was born.
Was it? Okay. So yeah, of course, and
I stopped it.
He came into his own when he started.
With cream.
Yeah, when he was boosting Constantine. So you're right, about 305, something like that. But during that time, he'd certainly had access to all the records in Caesarea that had been gathered through the years, right from the time of the law.
So I guess my question was, back to you, Stephen, is like, so we have what from Eusebius? Like, we have originals from that era, or why would we have those? I mean,
I think it was because he was certainly very well honoured. It would have gone to Constantinople and to the other churches. And look, the honest thing is, I don't know right now, Tom, that I can find them exactly, but I believe certainly they are preserved, or at least copied in full, right down to today.
Okay, all right, thanks. That's the sort of thing I was wondering, if we've got them on, if we've got a chain of, or whether they're fragments, or whether whether they're like the early gospel, whether we just have fragments of them, or whether we actually have full copies, and we're confident of the authorship of these things.
I am. He was well sponsored by Constantine, so I think he would have had plenty of resources to and there would have been multiple copies made. So you could Google it, but I'd be pretty confident that the text of Eusebius is pretty secure.
One advantage of doing Reasonable Faith by Zoom, I was just about to do that.
Right. Anybody else?
The one thing I didn't quite follow when you're going through, were you saying that John's Gospel was written by John the son of Zebedee, or that it was written by John, the different disciple who was not one of the 12?
The view of Richard Bauckman, who wrote Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, it's a pretty iconic text, is he actually believed that it was John the Elder and not John the son of Zebedee. But the early church, and Papias promoted that view too, but most church fathers said it was John the son of Zebedee.
Because if it was a different John, that would mean there'd be somebody else besides the 12 in at the Last Supper.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and he's saying that there was the inner group, which was the 12, but there were many other disciples that followed Jesus as well.
Well, I've got no argument with that particular point, but they weren't all at the Last Supper in certain places. There were certain bits that were restricted to the 12. There are certain bits there was just 3 of them.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know how that works out.
May I ask then, please, Kevin, who wrote Revelation?
Yeah, you can ask it.
And that was John.
Yeah, I thought it was John.
Yeah, well, yeah, but which John? But Revelation seems to be a pretty different style from the other Johannine texts.
Well, from the rest of the New Testament, if you're going to put it that way.
Yeah.
But that's where I was going to bring up something. if we're looking at textual criticism and textual form and interpretation, that means that the difference between Papias's claim about Hebrew versus Greek is probably pretty important.
How does that relate to John's Gospel?
Well, back to the point you were making before about the claim that that Mark was written in was written in
Matthew.
Hebrew. Sorry, Matthew was written in Hebrew, and yet textual scholars say that it's actually written in Greek.
On that one, there are certain things in Matthew's Gospel that don't go very well in Greek because they are taken from Aramaic idioms, and idioms do not translate very well into a different language.
Sure, but if we're going to rely on textual criticism, the point that I guess that is raised by what Kevin's saying,
yep,
and what he's presented in my mind, is that if we're going to rely on textual criticism in one way to give us confidence in the Gospels, and yet we're going to discount it here because we've got some evidence that suggests that it's wrong, that needs some reconciliation in my mind. Am I being clear, or am I... Like, if we've got a tool which is called textual interpretation, which we're going to rely on, and we do rely on in other places to date the Gospels, to figure out the genre, to whatever, right? If we're going to use that tool, and we would now to say that tool which says that the Gospels are written in Greek, that Gospel is written in Greek, and yet we've got a record that says that it's written in Hebrew, then that issue needs to be reconciled in my mind.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's necessarily just the textual critics who are saying that. Like, the aim of the textual critic is to get the most accurate Greek text they can, and that's their charter. But whether they are the ones who actually pushing the line that the original was Greek and not Hebrew, I'm not sure about that.
Okay, all right, okay. So the question is who's pushing the Greek and who and on what basis?
Yeah,
I took it from what you said that it was from textual criticism.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
And particularly at this distance, none of these tools are 100% accurate. We can rely on it completely. I read an essay, I suppose, by C.S. Lewis some years ago about how literature critics examine the writings of somebody and produce a great huge explanation of how and why it was written and all that lies behind it. And Lewis was saying he was fascinated at learning some of the things behind some of his own writings, what these critics were saying.
Yeah.
I don't think it's of any great moment whether he wrote originally in Hebrew or Greek. We've got a Greek text, which is very, very ancient. We know that from all the manuscripts, and it's been established, by looking at the tiny variations in the manuscripts. We're very confident of the original Greek text. That's what we've got to work with. It doesn't matter much until an ancient document is found in Hebrew that you can really demonstrate is more original. That doesn't really matter. And as for the Gospel of John, I think it's almost certain that it was John, the son of Zebedee, who wrote that Gospel. When he says in that later chapter, is it 20 or 21, that the one who leaned back on Jesus' bosom at the Last Supper, it can hardly have been anybody else, even though he doesn't name himself. He's talking about it is himself who wrote the Gospel. It can hardly have been anybody else, because there were the 12 who were there at the Last Supper. There's the inner three whom we know from elsewhere. Many times it speaks of them as Peter, James, and John. But it's not Peter, because Peter is the one who actually asked this person. It's almost certain that it's John, without being absolutely 100%.
There's also the other aspect that in the synoptics, James and John, the son of Zebedee, are mentioned frequently, but not in John.
Yeah.
And so that may
That's
be
correct.
him being humble.
It's a big stretch to put it to anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not dogmatic.
I think maybe it is a bit of a deal if Matthew's gospel was originally in Hebrew, because
Why?
any kind of translation is from another era is hazardous. If we're looking at the present Matthew's gospel, if we're looking at it directly from Greek, not much chance of getting it wrong. If you're looking at Hebrew translated into Greek and then translated into English, you've got sort of double jeopardy there. You've got to be a little bit more careful about reading precisely what is meant in parts of that.
Yeah, I think there's the other issue is if Papias was wrong about how which language it was written in, is he wrong in other things as well? So it kind of raises the issue of the reliability of Papias. So,
thank you. That was the flip side of where I was going. If we can't trust the textual, if we can trust the textual interpretation, right? Then what does it say about Papias?
Also, I think what he actually said wasn't that Matthew's gospel was written originally in Hebrew, but that Matthew wrote the oracles of the Lord in Hebrew. So the suggestion there is that he actually wrote a compilation of things that Jesus had said in the Hebrew, and then later used that to write his gospel.
yeah, well, the other issue that's been raised is when he actually speaks about Mark and Matthew, is he referring to the same documents that we have?
Okay. Now that both of those could be possible reconciliations, I'd go with that. That makes. But is that what you said though, Kevin? Is what Brian just said right? Because I wasn't. That wasn't the way I heard it when you put the slide up. Sorry to question you, Brian. I'm sure you're right.
Have you got that slide easily, Kevin?
I can bring it back, yeah. Let's see. I'll have to share again. Let's see where I find it. No, wrong one, sorry. I'll share screen. Which is the one? Yeah.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, that I got you.
Yeah,
Now, let's see, I'll bring it across. And we'll go down. I think it's a fair way through, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's in yellow.
That one. Is that what I mean?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, there you go. Sitz, you probably had it right, Brian.
Wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, yeah.
Yeah, okay. There we go. And everyone interpreted them as he was able and interpreted them to Greek. That would make perfect sense. There you go. Thank you, Brian. As one of my friends would say, nothing to see here, move along.
Where do you want to move? All right. Anybody else got something to contribute?
From an apologetic standpoint, I don't really get people saying that that it might not be historically accurate. They tend to take the viewpoint that it was made up. So that's the angle that they say that it's just to push their own, it's just a made up story, more like that Chinese whispers that you put up. So the argument doesn't really come up that they're not legitimate pieces, but that people just made up the story.
I think that's probably more a populist line. I don't think scholars think that way.
No, not scholars. I'm talking about it from an apologetics point of view, if you're talking to people.
Yeah.
The thing is, the closer you go back the dates, though, which is why this is pretty valuable, because the closer you go back to the dates and the more you make the attestation from others, and you ask people, and so what was the advantage of actually doing this when people were being thrown to the lions and burnt on crosses and etc. I mean, it starts to be more intellectually challenging once you establish a chain of custody of the documents,
that doesn't establish proof, because people want to go through all sorts of torture and suffering. That might demonstrate their sincerity and their passion, but it doesn't necessarily demonstrate that it's historically factual.
It means they're less likely to make it up.
No. They can believe something sincerely. A lot of people, Christians are not the only one who have suffered for their faith. It happens quite broadly amongst a range of different belief systems. So all I'm trying to say, it's not like you're making it up, like deliberately falsifying or telling untruths. You might believe something very passionately. That doesn't make it historically true. It just shows you that probably that you're very genuine about what you believe.
Yeah, but you're not likely to die for something you know is not true.
Oh yes, probably not. It'd be a bit foolish to do so. But certainly it would demonstrate a passion and that you sincerely believe it, because who would go through such suffering if you know it's a falsehood?
But that's isn't that where the other comment I made, and going back to the presentation being important, the chain of custody and the consistency.
But even if you've got historical claims about truth and so forth, that's historical. Yes, it certainly is important for our faith to try to demonstrate that the earliest documents that we have are historical. But the trouble with, we're now in the 21st century, and the world view, people don't see miracles like they saw, like as claimed in the New Testament. They don't see resurrections, and it makes it hard for them to believe that. That's the difficulty.
In some parts of the world, they claim they do see those things, but people who don't want to believe don't want to believe.
I think the fact that the Gospels use women as some of the first witnesses of Jesus' resurrection, when women weren't considered good witnesses, shows that they were telling it as it was. They weren't trying to make it up. That's one argument I've said to people.
Well, I think one thing that convinces me is if you actually read the Gospels yourself, you can make your own judgment whether they were made up or not. And the challenge is to actually get people to read them.
Yeah, that's right. It is. Yeah.
And what we're doing today on Papias.
I think that's the most powerful.
Sorry, Jeff.
I think that's the most powerful witness, the internal witness of those written documents. That's by far that's where faith comes from, actually reading those documents, reading and rereading them and meditating on them. And whether Papias was mistaken or not, as interesting as I find it, it doesn't really matter. It's not going to throw my faith if somebody proves that Papias didn't exist or that he was completely mistaken. That won't throw my faith one bit.
No, but what about your kids and grandkids? This is a battle I face at church a lot of the times, is we might be secure in our faith, but our kids are actually being evangelized, and our young folks, particularly Gen Z. And Bronwyn, is this where you're coming from?
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah.
Because they're hearing something very different, and our assumptions aren't speaking into their world, which is why I find what Kevin's presented so valuable.
Yeah, I don't really think it's going to make them come to faith if they think that Papias was real and a truthful writer or not. It really won't. But it will affect their faith if they read carefully and have expounded to them carefully everything that's in the gospel, actually written in the gospel.
I disagree, and this is a really
faith is still a
important
gift of God.
That's true. And
Yeah.
Paul reasoned in the Areopagus. He went and spoke Greek to the philosophers.
Yep.
He didn't say, "Hey, just read the old scriptures." He said, "Hey, I see you Athenians have many gods, have many idols." He spoke to them in their terms, so he could communicate with them.
Yeah.
Reading Papias is a little less esoteric. It might interest us, but it's probably not going to have much impact to young people who go to a youth group.
That's absolutely true. But what it does is it actually helps to deepen our knowledge of the early church, the chain of custody on those documents, the attestation from others, and I think that's exactly why I was asking, what do we know about the chain of custody of the documents? Do we know this from fragments, or can you look? And I did Google. It's part of the Logos.
Right.
I've got to pay $16, but it looks like you can actually buy the new Eusebius. And I think to know that you can show that this isn't Chinese whispers, I think what you presented tonight, Kevin, just as another little data point on that much larger issue.
Tom, did he sign the front cover for you?
I'm just telling you it's available. I haven't paid the money yet.
Was yours signed, Stephen?
No.
Well, and when doing the study, like I found it very interesting that they had the references to the first epistle of John and also the epistle of Peter, because people like to kind of date some of these documents into the 2nd century, and if what Papias is saying is correct, well, that's a pretty hard thing to do.
Yeah, to me tonight, I think this is all about chain of custody and consistency of how we know what we know today, or why we. So it's not what's in Romans 8. It's why we think what's in Romans 8 is actually useful to read. It's why, it's not what.
Sorry, what are you saying? Could you expand on that, please?
Yeah, to go to the point about the younger folks, millennials, Generation T, and maybe this is what, in fact, maybe this is what you were getting at, Dr. Rodney, is that what folks will question and ask today increasingly is don't tell me what's in Romans 8. Firstly, tell me why I should care. Tell me why I should care and why it matters to me. I think those are the two questions you ask first, and then you start talking about what's in Romans 8. Because if you can't establish for our kids, for our grandkids, for our youth, kids in our youth groups, if you can't establish that who's the Anglican minister that comes to reasonable faith, Kevin? John
Hereford.
John Hereford, as he was pointing out, and which is my experience, so many of our young folks have one foot out of our churches, and that's continuing. We only have to look around at how few we have in most of our churches. Maybe your churches are different, but in the Western world, there's a huge gap, and the figures show that all the time. And so that's, I guess, you're hearing a little bit of my passion here. Sorry for taking up your airtime, Kevin. But I think I'm supporting what Bronwyn's coming at here. I think Bronwyn and I might be coming from the same page.
So there is a movement within Christianity commonly referred to as neo-orthodoxy. Now, you had Karl Barth on the right of that movement, and then you had a New Testament scholar like Rudolf Bultmann on the left of that movement. And their argument was that we don't really come to faith through history. That's in the past. We really can't return to that, put ourselves in that history. It's the encounter with faith. But, for example, argue that we can't treat the Bible like a papal pope, as he put it, his words. Rather, we it's through the encounter with the risen Lord. I think he did believe in the resurrection, but we're not capable of observing that. It's the encounter. And that's as God moves and challenges us, as he speaks to us. He actually saw three forms of the word of God. There's the preached word, there's the personal encounter where God speaks to us, and there's the written word. All three, and just to read the word, you're going to read it in such a way that you don't encounter God, so it doesn't become revelation to us until God encounters us. And then you've got Rudolf Bultmann, who tried to actually demythologize all the New Testament claims, and he thought that we had to make sense of the gospel in terms of our modern understanding. So he would tend to demythologize, and obviously he had a lot of opposition in the way he expressed that. But he also spoke of the encounter and its authentic existence. That's what the gospel is about. So it's this spirit encounter, but in a very different assumptions to Barth.
Yeah, but even people who, all of us who have encountered Jesus, probably at some stage, a question arises, a question comes into our
But they'd
head.
say that you couldn't do that, you see. That's the difference about neo-orthodoxy.
Yeah, but I mean, the question comes into our head, is it true? And ultimately, you do have to go back into history, because the evidence that underlines that...
It depends on understanding what the gospel's about. Like with Bultmann, it's not about an historical Jesus. It's not about believing in the resurrection. In fact, he strongly believed in old tradition, which he thought like a lot of ideas were added in the 2nd century and so on, things like that. So it's the encounter with God that's important, not the mythological claims of the New Testament in particular. So, so that's what he would say. So it didn't matter if it was filled with all sorts of errors and so forth.
Even after an encounter with Jesus, and we can all become Christians, and
the Christ of faith he would talk about.
We know the reality of it, but still we get these attacks, we get these questions arise.
Well, he would say that historical accuracy is irrelevant, basically.
Irrelevant to him, but not to everyone else.
No, true. But I'm just saying on basis of the understanding.
Yeah.
He really sort of was influenced by Heidegger existentialism as
Gordon was trying to say something, so I think we should let him say it.
But I'm just saying you can't discount the history, because the history is in the Old Testament. The history is all the miracles, the fulfilled prophecy, all that stuff. A lot of which can be read, and probably should be read, sort of rationally, unlike the sort of Sunday school, gee whiz, look at God doing the impossible again kind of stories that we heard when we were children. We need a more mature way of interpreting and looking at that. But the evidence is there. The convincing of the reality of Christ is there in the Old Testament, pointing to the New. Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, and that's very relevant to those who think of an historical Jesus and who believe faith, the history is essential to the faith. But there are some who interpret it in such a way where it's not essential. That's all I'm saying.
I think the Apostle Paul dealt with that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where he said, if the historical stuff did not happen, then this is all pointless, and we should be pitied more than anybody.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, the passage from 1 John also, that which we've touched, heard, seen, and all that sort of thing, was pretty important to him as well.
Hey, I don't want to steal your job here, Kevin, but I noticed that Joshua, you're the youngest of us. To the questions that Bronwyn and I was sort of getting at, and I know that Rick and I think Rick left, but Rick and I have talked about previously. Do those sort of questions continue to come up with your friends and folks more, younger than the rest of the cohort?
Cool. I was slightly distracted by my wife for a minute there. Apologies. I think what you said about placing the question does definitely resonate with myself. You're sort of saying why it's necessary before discussing the matter. But that's probably more just because we, I guess, for myself, would have a lot less experience with a lot of the historic sort of historicity and whatnot of the Bible, to what you guys have in your understanding. So, yeah.
Well, is it important to you, Josh?
To place the question, yeah, it is. Yeah, because I mean, even with these discussions, I can quite easily get lost just because I haven't the same background knowledge as a lot of people.
But Josh is different from other people because he's an engineer, and we're a different race.
Not wrong. Not wrong. Yeah. No. But yeah, no. What you were saying definitely resonated for sure.
Thanks. Sorry, I only picked on you because you're.
No, that's all right. You picked on me at the wrong time because my wife and mother-in-law came in and were having I was interested in, so my attention got moved.
No worries. Thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Rodney, do you actually, you said this is what Bultmann said, but do you actually agree with him?
No, I don't actually agree with him, no. But, I mean, especially in the liberal Christian tradition, it isn't the historical Jesus as such or miracles as such. It's about, it's about the essence of his message, and that was encounter with God, about living as authentic human beings. And certainly they take on the ethos of love, compassion, and all that sort of thing. But the other stuff is not important. I even found when I was studying political theology, is what Jesus meant in terms of justice and society and so forth, black theology and things like that. Wasn't they did recognise the historical Jesus in some sense, like, for example, his value in about social justice issues, but they didn't seem to recognise in the traditional sense of Jesus being the divine Son of God, virgin, and being born of a virgin, and so on. They didn't see that as terribly authentic. No, I was just simply speaking, just giving you a different sort of perspective on things. The theology out there is very broad and wide.
Surely you can counter that just by saying that all these other theologies, feminist theology, black theology, liberation theology, whatever it is, all these are second agendas which detract from the centrality of the gospel, and all these other influences they don't resonate at all.
Well, that would be the case if they share your beliefs, but if they don't, that's not going to work.
Well, yeah, some people are not going to believe us, but if you try to put a second agenda on top of the gospel, you weaken the gospel. That's my view, and I think a view of many Christians.
Peter, that's right. I actually think all these things are sophisticated forms of unbelief.
Yeah, there's truth to that.
Well, it's driven by different worldviews.
I'm not familiar with Bultmann. I'm not familiar with Bultmann, but from what Dr. Rodney's just outlined about him, about demythologizing the New Testament, and it's all dressed up in words about the authentic Jesus and things like that. But it's actually just a sophisticated form of unbelief.
Mm.
It's not the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Often wondered why some people want to identify themselves as Christians.
Well, in fact,
I do too.
it's another form of Gnosticism, which of course
Well,
goes way back.
I think they certainly find certain aspects of Jesus' teachings quite appealing, such as personal self-sacrifice, love of the neighbour, social justice. So in that sense, they identify, but whether you judge it as adequate or not is another issue.
Mm. Mm.
Well, I don't think it's Christianity. You know, I mean, it's just as much Buddhism as there's anything else.
Mm.
Just being kind to people, for example. Certainly Jesus presents that, and we should be kind to people. But you'll get the same message with pretty similar interpretation out of Islam and Buddhism and anything else. It's just it's not Christianity.
I've got a book by a process theologian called by John Cobb, and he's written a book, The Mutual Transformation of Christianity and Buddhism. And the way he makes them fit together, I think, makes me cringe, to be honest.
Yeah, we're all just raised out the mountain. We all get to the top in our own way.
I had that discussion with the chaplain who came to school, and we were just chatting when she first came to the school about 5 years ago, and I just asked her, she was only young, how she was going to share Christ, and she said, just by my witness. And I said, unfortunately, that's not going to be good enough because there are some really exceptional people around here who show all the characteristics that you would like to have in a Christian person. They've all got it. In fact, they're more tolerant than I am. So, and surrounded by a lot of different worldviews that I am in my work at my school, it has to be more than that, basically. It's more than a win. It has to be more than that. But anyway, that's another story.
When you say witness, you're talking about life, not verbal witness. You're talking about like actions and things like that.
Yeah. It has to be more than actions.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, you have to somehow get into discussions with people about the true meaning and value of the human being and life, basically, and how we make up for all our mistakes. Yeah, and whether whether being good enough is going to be is enough. Like I've even got an atheist friend who lives, is a nice person. Lives a good life, and it still sort of speaks to me of someone who's trying to see if they can, if God really does exist, that they'll just make the grade, just by being good. It's just not good enough because none of us are. So, yeah.
I posted a link, Bronwyn, in the chat to, there's a podcast called Reasonable Faith with this guy called William Lane Craig.
Never heard of
it. From 3 weeks ago, and it's about Gen Z atheism and how they're being actively evangelized away.
Yeah.
And I found it the best way of stating the problem that I care about with our young folks, bar none. It's only about 15, 20 minutes, the episode, but I really recommend it to anybody who cares about our young folks. So I put it in the chat, the link's in the chat. You can get it as a podcast or
I just opened it.
Yeah, no, I'll watch it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Guys, I got to leave now, so thanks. Nice talking to you.
Yep.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Cheers.
All right.
Just raising the issue of apologists, of course, we've had two great losses in the last week or so, haven't we? Ravi Zacharias and David Pawson.
I've never heard of the second one.
Oh, David Pawson. Oh, yeah, great preacher. I wouldn't call him necessarily apologist, but certainly a great preacher who would adopt and would speak to many issues. If you haven't heard of David Pawson, suggest you look him up.
All right, okay.
Yeah, it's very good.
I haven't been able to bring myself to read too many of the tributes or anything. I posted a couple of, and thank you, Ravi, in the thread on Twitter and stuff, but I haven't yet been able to bring myself, to be honest, to actually view too many of the tributes and stuff. But his funeral, I think, was earlier today or yesterday. So.
No, it's tomorrow. No, Saturday morning for us. Like.
No, that's a memorial today.
Yeah, his funeral. That was a private funeral.
Funeral.
They're having a memorial.
Private funeral.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. I saw on the picture that Sam Albury was actually preaching.
Was he?
I thought, people around us don't understand that the most diverse organisation on this planet, bar none, throughout all of history, is the Church of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
They don't. That's another thing that our kids don't actually understand.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I thought having an Indian born, Canadian raised apologist being buried in Atlanta with a gay Englishman presiding at his funeral, if that doesn't speak of diversity, I'm not really sure what does.
Yeah. Have they got it televised today? Did they record it?
There was an article and stuff that I actually sent to a friend, because when we were staying in Hobart, they have a prison ministry, and the article was basically, it was Sam Albury standing at Ravi's coffin, and it was the title was Ravi Zacharias buried in casket built by prisoners.
They were, yeah. There's a certain prison that he used to visit.
Angola, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just briefly, if I may, mention a bit about David Pawson. He had the opportunity as an RAF chaplain at the end of the Second World War to actually speak to some of the Germans who'd just been tried at the Nuremberg trial and were about to be executed. And at least General Keitel, the head of the OKH, came to the Lord. So he had that early on in his ministry to be able to speak to men who are about to meet their maker, having been in that evil regime. So no, he is a truly an impressive preacher, perhaps not so much an apologist, but certainly deals with a lot of the world's issues, spoke very eloquently on the 7 churches of Revelation. A very worthwhile guy to listen to.
Was his name spelled Pawson?
That's the one.
Right, okay.
He was also a visiting speaker at Table College when I was a student there many years ago.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right, we don't have to go to the distance to go to 9 o'clock, so you happy to wind up at that point?
Yeah, pack up the chairs.
Okay, and get the tables in line. All right, so thank you very much for your attendance, and I hope it was of interest and helpful.
So it's me next week, right?
Kevin.
Yeah. What? Yes. Now, what was it? I've forgotten.
Cyber sex.
Cyber sex. That's you, isn't it, Tom? Right. Yes. So it's you're on next time, are you, Tom?
Yeah, I think so. It's 2 weeks' time, right?
Yeah. Have you started preparing it?
I have started preparing, and I'm going to make sure that I don't have an hour and a half's content that I try and pack into an hour this time.
Right,
this time for sure. This time.
So all you guys from South Australia?
We had somebody from Sydney. So
okay. I'm from near Wollongong,
right,
New South Wales.
Right. Okay.
I was from Wollongong.
Well,
sorry.
Gordon comes from the UK, doesn't he? Scotland.
Yeah, he does.
Okay.
Yeah, but he's a resident of Hallett's Cove at the moment.
Oh, is he?
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Tom, are you still in Hobart?
No, we got back. We've now finished our first week of quarantining.
Oh.
So yeah, we should have flown in via England. We would have been right. Hey.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Crazy.
Jeff, what were you? Kevin tells me, because I'm going to talk about IJM and porn and cyber sex and stuff. That doesn't go over what you're doing next week or anything. Because yours is wild sex, right?
That's right. Yeah. I don't think it. I don't think it will. I've got this book called Wild Sex that I found a year ago. So it's actually about the animal world, wildlife, and in particular, it's like a popular science, really. Yeah, but that's the background to it. Yeah, and it's the way in which sexual reproduction occurs amongst the whole of animal creation, and it's incredibly diverse. And I'm wanting to talk about what the implications of that are. You know, in some ways, we human beings are animals. We share a lot with all the animals, but then in other ways, we're very different. And I want to talk about that, particularly in relation to sex and sexual morality, the sexual activity of animals and of human beings, and of the morality that exists amongst human beings, and why that is the case, and what the implications are about that. So it's kind of is a bit to do with the question of, well, are we animals, and are we just animals? And if not, well, what's the difference, and why is it different for human beings? But particularly looking at the issue of sex, sexual attraction, sexual reproduction. Okay, so I don't reckon that's going to cross your subject. I don't know exactly what you're going to talk about.
They do actually dovetail, and
yeah, right.
That would be. But yours would almost be better to show I'd show the consequences of that not being true. But anyway, no, that's fine.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, Tom, you go first.
Yeah,
so
so
it's more
I
Jeff's
take
problem than yours.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. So
Yeah.
and I'm sorry it's going to be heavy, but you know what? It's going to be real. It's going to be the way the world is.
Yeah.
So I hope it'll be useful, and honestly, I'm going to try and encourage as many of my friends and that to come, because they need to know. We need, if we got kids, grandkids, young folks that we care about, churches we care about, we actually need to know what's going on, because this is the way the world is. So anyway. All right. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin.
Look forward to it.
Is that the wine
thank you,
cabinet
Kevin.
behind you?
I was going to say, I'll give you wine.
I don't know what you're talking about.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you. All right.
Bye.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.
See ya.